All right, so we are on to our third video on the genres, third and final video. What we'll talk about in this video is the epistles and the apocalyptic literature, and there's not too much to be said in specifics in regards to these, because they're almost on opposite ends of the spectrum. The epistles, I would say, are probably the easiest genre for New Testament, or at least Western believers, to interpret. And apocalyptic literature is probably the hardest genre for Western believers to interpret, possibly even Eastern believers. But I'm looking at it from a Western mindset, so I can't speak for them. But anyway, when it comes to these two genres, like I said, they're the easiest and hardest genres to interpret. So for epistle, we'll start off easy and then we'll go hard. Epistle, we're talking about the author and the audience. Or the first thing you want to look at is the author and audience. And it's almost more significant in this case to understand the author and the audience. Epistles are letters, and they have, like I said, authors and audience. The author has a situation and a purpose for writing. So the situation is almost more significant for the epistle than it is for the other genres. When it comes to the author, so when it comes to this, because the author's writing from a specific, like I said, situation. So think of a number of the epistles Paul wrote. He wrote from prison. That tells us about something his heart is going through. He also had a purpose so he was also writing with a purpose to not just lay out the theology. Think of even the letter to the Romans, the Roman Christians, the Roman church. There's a lot of theology in that book, but he wrote it with a purpose of establishing and strengthening that church in the gospel. So this is not just reading it like a textbook. You really want to read it from the perspective of the author and the reception of the audience in order to understand what they were trying to say. The audience also has something going on. These letters were not written in a vacuum. There's something going on. Think of, again, the Roman the book of Romans, that the author, that Paul wrote to the church, that was, again, not in a vacuum. There was divisions in this church over what they were eating and what they were drinking and the days they were recognizing. And Paul's writing into that situation to help them, to encourage them to be unified and united in the gospel. So that's really what's significant when you're interpreting an epistle. Like I've said before, this is very much an easy genre to write, or easy genre to interpret. So when we look at the purpose, so again, thinking about purpose, when you're looking at a passage, you want to try to understand it in light of the purpose of writing. Why did Paul include this in the letter? He wasn't just writing a postscript. This is attached to his overall purpose. So lastly, thinking of apocalyptic literature lets the reader in on end-time events. And they do this through symbols and images. We need to remember when we're interpreting this that it was saying something to the original audience. When we look at some of this, some of what's been written in apocalyptic literature, we need to remember that even though it did not happen, or hasn't even happened yet, that doesn't mean that it wasn't included, or that it didn't have a purpose for the original recipients, that they wouldn't have been able to understand it. So remember, the symbols and images have meaning to the original recipient. That's possibly what the most important thing to remember in apocalyptic literature is that they have a meaning to that day. So yeah, so just to wrap this up, so I guess before I get off apocalyptic literature, I should say a little bit more about it. So when we think of apocalyptic literature, we're thinking specifically of the book of Revelation, but there are some apocalyptic writings in the Old Testament too. So keep that in mind when you're reading books, especially like Daniel, that there are portions of that book that are written in an apocalyptic way. So that being said, epistle genre, it's a letter from an author to an audience. Both have specific situations that they are surrounded by, so we need to be informed about that. And then for apocalyptic literature, it's writing about end time events that the original audience would have understood, even though they haven't happened yet. They might not have understood them perfectly, but they would have been able to understand the intent of what was being written. Think of specifically the book of Revelation. That book was written to give first century believers hope. Churches received that were being persecuted for their faith, and they received hope through that. So that's what we have for the genres. So I hope that these videos have been a blessing to you. There are going to be 2 more videos to come. One on application, how do we apply what we've interpreted? And lastly, and the last video I'll do is about the resources that you have available to you to be able to help you interpret your Bible. And until next time, God bless.